Hi again, guys. When we left off last week with chapter 10, Maniac, let's see, he had some trouble in the West End with John McNabb and his whole group of Cobras that were after him. So he ran away, and he ran the whole way until he got into the East End. And of course, they quit chasing him there because they were afraid to go into the East End, because back where they lived in that time, the blacks and the whites didn't mix on each other's side of town. So now Maniac's in the East End, and he ran into Mars Bar Thompson. And those two had a conflict. Mars Bar stole Amanda's book from him and a page ripped out of it. And the crowd was cheering for Mars Bar to beat him up. And probably the only thing that stopped that from happening was when that lady came by and put her broom down in between them and kind of shushed them each away. So that's where we left off, with Maniac standing there on the East End, looking for Amanda Beale's house. But now, instead of being excited to return her book to her, he's upset because he has that one page that Mars Bar ripped out of the book and it's crumpled. And that's where we are, chapter 11. Now what? Maniac uncrumpled the page, flattened it out as best he could. How could he return the book to Amanda in this condition? He couldn't, but he had to. It was hers. And judging from that first morning when he met her, she was pretty finicky about her books. What would make her madder? To not get the book back at all, or to get it back with one page ripped out? Oh, Maniac cringed at both prospects. He wandered around the East End now, jogging slowly, in no hurry to find 728 Sycamore Street anymore. He was passing a vacant lot when he heard an all too familiar voice yell, "Hey, Fishbelly!" He stopped, turned. This time, Mars Bar wasn't alone. A handful of other kids trailed with him down the sidewalk. Maniac waited. Coming up to him, Mars Bar said, "Where are you running, boy?" "Nowhere." "You running from us? You afraid?" "No, I just like to run," Maniac said. "You want to run?" Mars Bar grinned. "Go ahead. We'll give you a head start." Maniac grinned back. "No thanks." Mars Bar held out his hand. "Give me my book." Maniac shook his head. Mars Bar glared. "Gimme it." Maniac shook his head. Mars Bar reached for it. Maniac pulled it away. They moved in on him now. They backed him up. Some high schoolers were playing basketball up the street, but they weren't noticing or caring, and there wasn't a broom-swinging lady in sight. Maniac felt a hard flatness against his back. He was up against the wall. Suddenly, his world was very small and very simple. A brick wall behind him, and a row of scowling faces in front of him. He clutched the book with both hands. The faces were closing in. Then he heard a voice call, "Is that you, Jeffrey?" The faces parted. At the curb was a girl on a bike. Who do you think? Yeah, it's Amanda. Remember, she's the only one that still calls him Jeffrey. She hoisted the bike to the sidewalk and walked it over. She looked at the book, at the torn page. "Who ripped my book?" Mars Bar pointed at Maniac. "He did." Amanda knew better. "You ripped my book." Mars Bar's eyes went as big as headlights. "I did not." "You did. You lie." "I didn't." "You did." She let the bike fall to Maniac. She grabbed the book and she started kicking Mars Bar right in his beloved sneakers. Remember at the beginning I told you that Amanda was basically my favorite character besides Maniac, of course. I think you're starting to see why. Think about some character traits of Amanda. We already talked about how she is kind. We talked about how she loves to read. And now I'm thinking she's not really afraid of much, is she? She didn't believe when Mars Bar said he didn't do it. She just grabbed him and started kicking him right in his sneakers that he loves so much. I like Amanda. She started yelling at him as she was kicking his sneakers. "I got a little brother and a little sister that crayon all over my books. And I got a dog that eats them and poops on them. And that's just inside my own family. And I am not gonna have nobody else messing with my books. Do you understand?" By then, Mars Bar was hauling on up the street past the basketball players who were rolling on the asphalt with laughter. Amanda took the torn page from Maniac. To her, it was the broken wing of a bird. That's a neat metaphor, huh? A pet out in the rain. She turned misty eyes to Maniac. "Oh, it's one of my favorite pages." Maniac smiled. "We can fix it." The way he said it, She believed it. So she said, "Want to come to my house?" "Sure," he said. Chapter 12. When they walked in, Amanda's mother was busy with her usual tools, a yellow plastic bucket and a sponge. She was scrubbing purple crayon off of the TV. "Mom," said Amanda, "this is Jeffrey." She whispered, "What's your last name?" Excuse me. He whispered, "McGee." She said, "McGee." Mrs. Beale held up a hand. "Hold it," and went right on scrubbing. When she finally finished, she straightened up, turned, and said, "Now what?" "Mom, this is Jeffrey McGee. You know." Amanda hardly finished when Maniac zipped across the room and stuck out his hand. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Beale." "Mrs. Beale?" They shook hands. Mrs. Beale smiled. "So you're the book boy." She started nodding. Amanda came home one day. "Mom, there's a boy I loaned one of my books out to." I said, "Loaned a book? You?" She said, "Mom, he practically made me. He really likes books. I met him on—" "Mom!" Amanda screeched. "I never said all that." Mrs. Beale nodded solemnly. "No, of course you didn't." And she gave Maniac a huge wink, which made Amanda screech louder, until something crashed in the kitchen. So Mrs. Beale ran, Amanda and Maniac ran. The scene in the kitchen stopped them cold. All right, guys, this is a good spot to visualize. Picture, they ran into the kitchen, and this is what they saw. One little girl, eyes wide, standing on a countertop. One little boy, eyes wide, standing just below her on a chair. One shattered glass jar, and some stringy pale-colored glop on the floor, and one growing cloud of sauerkraut fumes. Ew. The girl was Hester, age 4. The boy was Lester, age 3. In less than 5 minutes, while Mrs. Beale and Amanda cleaned up the floor, Hester and Lester and their dog Bow Wow were in the backyard, wrestling and tickling and jumping and just generally going wild with their new buddy and victim, Maniac McGee. He seems to be fitting in at the Beale house pretty nicely, huh? Maniac was still there when Mr. Beale came home from his Saturday shift at the tire factory. He was there for dinner when Hester and Lester pushed their chairs alongside his. He was there to help Amanda mend her torn book. He was there watching TV afterward, with Hester riding on one knee and Lester on the other. He was there when Hester and Lester came screaming downstairs with a book, Amanda screaming even louder after them, the kids shoving the book and themselves onto Maniac's lap. Amanda finally calming down because they didn't want to crayon the book. They only wanted Maniac to read. And so he read Lyle, Lyle, Crocodile to Hester and Lester, and even though they pretended not to listen, to Amanda and Mr. and Mrs. Beale. And he was there when Hester and Lester were herded upstairs to bed. And Mrs. Beale said, "Don't you think it's about time you're heading home, Jeffrey? Your parents will be wondering." So Maniac, wanting to say something, but not knowing how, got into the car for Mr. Beale to drive him home. Where do you think he's going to tell Mr. Beale to take him? He can't really say, "Just take me to the deer shed at the zoo." And then he made a mistake. He waited only 2 or 3 blocks to go by before he said to Mr. Beale, "This is it." Okay, why is that a mistake? Okay, they're in the East End now, right? The Beales live in the East End. The Beales are a black family living in the East End. Maniac's a white boy, and he does not live in the East End. No whites live in the East End. Remember we said the whites and blacks didn't mix in this area. So Mr. Beale, I think, knew when Maniac said, "This is it," that it wasn't. Mr. Beale stopped, but he didn't let Maniac out of the car. He looked at him funny. Mr. Beale knew what his passenger didn't. East End was East End, and West End was West End. And the house that this little white lad was pointing to was filled with black people, just like every other house, the whole way up to Hector Street. Mr. Beale pointed this out to Maniac. Maniac's lips started to quiver right there, with the car idling in the middle of the street. Maniac told him he didn't really have a home, unless you counted the deer shed at the zoo. Oh, I just picture that scene. That's one that always kind of makes me want to blink back tears when I read it too. I picture this little boy in the car, his lips starting to quiver, and he has to say, "Well, I don't really have a house." What do you think Mr. Beale's going to do? Take a second. If we were in school, I'd say, tell somebody beside you what you think Mr. Beale's going to do. So you can turn and tell yourself, or turn and tell your dog, what do you think Mr. Beale's going to do now with this new information? Okay, let's see. Mr. Beale made a U-turn right there, and he headed back home. Only Mrs. Beale was still downstairs when they walked into the house. She listened no more than 10 seconds worth of Mr. Beale's explanation before saying to Maniac, "You're staying here." Did anybody predict that? Did any of you think Mr. Beale would just take him home with him and Mrs. Beale would allow him to stay there? Not long after, Maniac was lying in Amanda's bed, Amanda having been carried over to Hester and Lester's room, where she often slept anyway. Before Maniac could go to sleep, however, there was something he had to do. He flipped off the covers, went downstairs. Before the puzzled faces of Mr. and Mrs. Beale, he opened up the front door and looked at the 3 cast iron digits nailed to the door frame, 728. 728 Sycamore Street. He kept staring at them, smiling. Then he closed the door and said a cheerful, "Good night," and went back to bed. Do you know why I looked at the numbers? Maniac McGee finally had an address. Now he has a place. When someone says, "Where do you live?" he can say 728 Sycamore. I think that was very important to him that he had an address. All right, that's all we're going to read for today. We'll pick back up tomorrow with chapter 13 to see how things are going for Maniac now that he's staying with the Beales. Bye, guys.